Okay.
Yep.
All right. And now I'm going to start the intro.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Five, four,
2, 1. Welcome to CNLive, Season 5, Episode 12, Global Greens, War or Peace. I'm Joe Loria, the Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. With the dangers of a wider Middle East war threatening to break out and the perilous conflict in Ukraine far from over, where do Green parties around the world stand on the question of peace and war? The Green Party movement began in the Australian state of Tasmania in April 1972, when the first Green Party in the world contested in state elections. Later that year, the first Green Party in Europe was founded in Switzerland. The next year saw the first British Green Party, which began as the Ecology Party. From the first, an anti-war and nonviolent position was at the core of the Green Party politics worldwide. Indeed, peace was one of the four pillars of the Green movement, along with ecology, social justice, and democracy. In the Australian capital, Canberra, in 2001, the Global Green Charter was adopted by 800 delegates from 72 national Green parties. It called for ecological wisdom, social justice, participatory democracy, nonviolence, sustainability, and respect for diversity. So peace was a bedrock principle of the Green movement from the start, including in what became the largest and most influential Green Party in the world, in Germany. They began as an anti-war party too in 1980, but within 20 years, the German Greens had broken with this tradition, supporting NATO's attack on Serbia in 1999, and then NATO's war in Afghanistan in 2001. This split the Global Greens movement. Today, under the leadership of Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, the German Green Party is one of the most pro-war parties in the world, rivaling the U.S. Democratic Party. Baerbock is infamous for saying we, meaning the West, are at war with Russia over Ukraine. Last week, she was in Israel, giving unqualified support for Israel as it pursues policies of shutting off water, food, and electricity to 2.2 million Gazans, demanding hospitals in the north of Gaza evacuate 2,000 patients in a war zone, had already killed more than 2,500 Gazan civilians with aerial bombardments, and is poised to launch a ground war that threatens to engulf the entire Middle East in war. Indeed, differences within the global Greens movement were starkly demonstrated earlier today, Monday, in Australia, when federal Green Party leader Adam Bandt, according to the Australian newspaper, quote, tried to amend a statement of support for Israel with one condemning, quote, war crimes perpetrated by the state of Israel, including the bombing of Palestinian civilians. Quote, quoting the Australian, Mr. Bandt said the Greens condemned the Hamas attack on innocent Israelis and called for Israeli hostages to be released, saying there was, quote, no place for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But he said the upcoming invasion of Gaza loomed as, quote, not just a humanitarian catastrophe, but a war crime. Quote, Australia cannot stay silent and indeed back that invasion, Mr. Bandt said, backing UN condemnation of Israel's decision to prevent food, water, fuel from getting into the enclave. The Greens amendment was defeated 107-7 with a number of MPs outside the chamber at the time. The motion was ultimately supported overwhelmingly 134 votes to 4, with only the Greens voting against. That was from the Australian today. Our guests to discuss this issue are Senator David Shoebridge, a Green senator, former Senator Rhiannon, also from Australia, Dimitri Lascaris, who we hope will join us later, a Green politician from Canada. And yesterday, we interviewed Diana Johnstone, an American journalist who was a former EU Greens Group press officer at the European Parliament. She spoke to us. She was on the ground in those days during the changes in the German Green Party. And we're going to begin by speaking to Rhiannon. I'm Joe Lauria, and this episode is produced by Kathy Vaughan. Lee, thank you very much for joining us. I want to begin with you. Just a little bit background. The Green Party movement began in Australia and the state of Tasmania, as I said. What prompted the start of the Green Party? And tell me, what role did the stance of nonviolence and anti-war play in its formation?
Look, I think we've got a very proud
Thank you very much for joining us. I want to begin with...
Well, we've got a very proud history, the Greens in Australia, and I've been very fortunate to be part of much of that. I do just need to correct you that there is contested history here, but the history books show that the first Greens Party was actually formed in New South Wales. But I think we can explore that at another time, and would love to do that with you. Look, what's wonderful about the history of the Greens is that we literally grew out of those very impressive social change movements of the 1980s and the last half of the last century. The women's movement, the environment movement, the social change movement, also the work of the trade union movement. And this has been incredibly important for the work that we've been involved in, for our success in getting more people elected. But it's also, I think, we face many challenges as a party, and how we work in social change movements is something that I hope we can explore in this discussion, because you've outlined a number of the problems that the Greens have run into in other countries, and we've had our fair share in Australia too. And often that is when we get out of touch with what is going on in the wider movement. So I hope we can talk about that, because I think the Greens have a great deal to offer, like we do in this present issue with the tragedy that's happening in Gaza. But if you're not rooted in the social change movement, not working closely with unions, you can get out of touch and make the mistakes that we see to this day in the German Greens. So I hope we can talk about that, because I think the Greens have a great deal to offer, like we do in this present issue with the tragedy that's happening in Gaza.
Thank you, Lee, for that answer. I just wonder, what was your role personally in the formation of the Green Party? Can you tell us about that?
The party was
I'm getting double feedback.
The first Greens Party was the Sydney Greens in Australia. It was formed in 1984, registered in 1985. I joined in 1990. And what inspired me to join was those 4 principles that you've already outlined to our listeners. So in the 1980s, I saw the work of the Greens. I saw them as very courageous people, and people who weren't just locked into parliamentary solutions. They were locked into building alliances that were about really making life better for ordinary people. And this is, I think, now a really big challenge for the Greens, because these days, to be frank about it, we're a very middle-class party. We, the majority of our members, the majority of our voters, middle class, they're tertiary educated, and that's just how it's played out. But we need to address this, because it means that our work with working class people is not being developed. We hardly ever hear people even talk about class issues, let alone use terms like class analysis, working class, etc. One, they're a big block of voters, but 2, these people are becoming more and more disadvantaged. Across the world is becoming a more unequal place, greater inequality, greater wealth concentrated amongst the rich, and it is happening at a faster rate. So I think this is a critical issue to keep the Greens grounded, to actually help grow our vote and get more people in Parliament, but to grow the social change movement that will drive the progressive change this world so desperately needs.
Well, as an emeritus member of the Green Party, and can you tell me how you see the global movement developing, and what role Germany has played, the German Green Party, in particular this leader, Annalena Baerbock?
Look, initially, the German Greens inspired people enormously. There's a beautiful story, actually, how the German Greens took the name Greens from Australia, not actually from the Greens Party, but because this is prior to when we're formed, from the Green Bands, which is this wonderful movement that has relevance to today, that brought unions, students, residents, various radical activists together in actually going on strike and building community support for public housing to save urban bushland, and a whole number of other fantastic campaigns. So that was a big part of of our early history. Look, the situation in Germany, I've got to say I'm not an expert on that. I'll leave it to other speakers who are on this session tonight. But I've followed what some of their changes in policy around nuclear energy, what happened in the Kosovo developments decades ago. And again, I think that's really troubling. And it's a real reminder that the Greens need to learn these lessons, because we can fall into more and more of these traps that the Social Democrats were formed to do good things by the people of this world, and so often they've sold out, and we need to learn the lessons and ensure we don't go down that path.
Thank you. David Shoebridge, did you take part in what happened on the floor of Parliament today? Could you tell us exactly what went down?
Well, we had parallel motions in our House of Representatives, our lower house, and in the Senate where I sit. So the divisions and the debate that you talk about in the House was being mirrored in the Senate as well, where my colleagues moved the same amendment to the government's motion. I think probably the real ideological divide that we saw playing out in Parliament today, in the Australian Parliament, was one of which is rooted in that 4th pillar for the Greens of peace and disarmament, and peace and non-violence. The most offensive thing in the motion that was being moved by the government today, it's a Labor government, notionally a socially, a social democrat, notionally left of centre government in Australia. The core failure in that motion was to condemn the collective punishment and the war crimes that are being instituted by the State of Israel, and to fail utterly to place any context in the appalling violence that we're seeing. And I want to condemn the violence that Hamas instituted against Israeli civilians, but the failure to, in any way, ground what we're seeing in decades and decades and decades of illegal occupation and violent assaults against the Palestinians people's rights to a homeland and their rights to live within secure UN-mandated borders. The failure to even mention those two things in a motion about the violence that we're seeing now was extraordinary. How could any fair-minded observer, any fair-minded friend, look at what is happening at the moment with Israel threatening the lives of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, almost half of whom are children, some 40%, aged 15 and under, telling them that if they don't flee their homes to heaven knows where, there's nowhere they can flee to, that they risk being literally blown apart in their homes and in their neighbourhoods and in their communities. These are innocent civilians who have committed no crime. At the same time as Israel is conducting an indiscriminate bombing campaign, killing thousands and thousands of Palestinians, issuing statements of collective punishment to exclude water and medicines and basic essentials of living. And at this time that the World Health Organization has said the directive from the Israeli military to evacuate hospitals was a death sentence to the patients in those hospitals. Now, how could you put a motion to a parliament, notionally coming from a centre-left party, which what Labor asserts to be in Australia, how could you put a motion about what is occurring at the moment and not reference that? And so that was the ideological debate. That was the core debate that was playing out in both the Senate, where I am, and in the House of Representatives. And we wouldn't put our name to a motion, although much of it was unobjectionable, calling out anti-Semitism, calling out Islamophobia, being deeply concerned of the violence that's been inflicted against Israeli civilians. But to not express the same concern about Palestinian lives, to not call out the war crimes of Israel, to not put it in the context of the occupation, that was what was being played out. And remarkably, in a democratically elected chamber, it wasn't a close vote. We saw the right-wing coalition parties and Labor join together and oppose our position and adopt a deeply, deeply unsettling motion.
I think it's troubling that it takes an enormous amount of courage to be able to say what you just said, and to say that in an amendment to a resolution, and that we're living in a context where the same thing happened with the Ukraine war. There were certain things you weren't allowed to say, whether that was an historical context that created that war, without in any way supporting one side or the other, just giving facts about it. This was shut down in many various ways, and it seems like that's the same process going on here, that they wouldn't allow you to even say that, and one cannot say that. Can you tell me a little more about this environment now that we're living in, this political climate?
Well, I mean, I don't think this is new for advocates of any kind of justice for the Palestinian people. I've been in politics in an elected capacity, first at state and now federal, for over a decade, and this kind of brutal attack on anybody who stands up for the basic essential rights of the Palestinian peoples to a state, to self-determination, to the core, what I would have assumed would be the core human rights that all democratically elected representatives would advocate for, have been mercilessly attacked. Too often you see people advocating, a sense of global human rights, and there's little asterisks on their advocacy for global human rights. And when you go to the footnotes, it says, well, human rights for everybody but Palestinians. And what I will say, though, is that in the discussions we're having in the community, we had a very large rally on the weekend in Sydney. Thousands and thousands of people came out to express their solidarity with the Palestinian people and call for an end of the war crimes against the Palestinian people, as well as calling out anti-Semitism, as well as calling out the crimes of Hamas. But that rally in Sydney was covered in a more balanced way than I have seen in the past. I think the mood in the centre of the Australian public is more open to seeing the reality of what's happening on the ground, and I think the ability of a small media clique to completely own the narrative is more limited now than it was even 5 years ago. So, and that rally that we had, thousands of people, of Australians, many of them obviously from the Palestinian diaspora and the broader Middle East diaspora, but also from across society, came out even though our police with the active encouragement from, again, a Labor premier, of the state of New South Wales, were threatening to use extraordinary powers and arrest anybody who turned up and dared protest for the rights of Palestinians. Those threats were vicious and they were nasty, coming from the premier and the police in New South Wales. I, together with a bunch of lawyers and advocates, stood up and opposed those, said we'd bring legal challenges if they brought those kinds of actions against peaceful protest. But in the face of those threats, we still saw thousands and thousands and thousands of Australians come out and rally. And I think we should also look for what's changing and for the seeds of hope in this. And I felt that on the weekend in that rally.
Well, in the face of all that, how important is a united Green movement around the world? Should Green parties be speaking with one voice when it comes to these questions of war and the dangerous time we're living in?
Well, I think a global peace movement has never been more critical. I would hope that the Greens can be a part of that and make those global connections to speak about peace and non-violence, to call out war crimes, call for a de-escalation, and advocate for converting those trillions of dollars from weapons into the things that are absolutely threatening to our existence. Not just the war that those weapons create, but imagine redirecting those funds to fighting poverty and climate change and the benefits that the global community could have for that. I don't think there's a more important time for us to have global solidarity. I think the Greens Party are a part of that, and I hope a growing part of that. I just note that in the recent New Zealand elections, we saw a significant increase in the Greens vote in New Zealand as well. So I am hopeful that we can be a part of that, but I think we're setting too high a bar if we say we must have global unanimity amongst the Green Party. There will be regional differences, there will be local differences, but I think one thing that hopefully will distinguish us going forward is that global commitment to that fourth pillar of peace and non-violence.
In our interview with Diana Johnstone, who was the press officer for the European Green Group in the late 80s, she said that it was the pursuit of power in coalitions in Germany that allowed the Greens to make these decisions to support the war in Afghanistan, and before that, the NATO war on Serbia. Is it ever worth giving up principles like that to get power, as much as it's important to have power to effect change?
Well, I think Lee spoke to one of the ways that hopefully a well-grounded Greens movement can avoid some of those parliamentary traps. The Labor Party that has been behaving in the way in which I described earlier started as a left-wing party committed to social progress and to opposing the status quo. They got trapped in parliamentary politics and trapped, the end result for some of these parties that initially came with a strong left-wing progressive drive to them becomes obtaining power and remaining in power. And if that is the beginning and the end of your parliamentary goals, to obtain power and remain in power, and you're willing to sort of, cut your cloth accordingly, junk the principles that get in the way of coming into power and remaining in power, then why are you there? What is your purpose if it's just to be another politician desperately keen to junk their principles to come into and remain in power? This is a long-term game for me. In many ways, the planet can't have too long a game. We've really got to solidify our global position on the left, I think, urgently. But you can see it if you go into parliamentary politics. You just simply look around you. You can see that how enticing it is to junk your principles, to just say, oh well, in the future. Oh well, I'll just abandon this principle now, and at some point in the future, I'll have sufficient power that I can actually act in a manner of principle. You surrender your soul in those moments, if you look at parliamentary politics, it does tend to be a permanent surrender of the soul.
On the danger of a wider war in the Middle East, Iran has told the UN, has told Israel through the UN, that if they should launch a ground invasion, that they will respond, most likely from Hezbollah in the north. We're looking then at a possible intervention even by the US, which has sent 2 aircraft carrier groups to the eastern Mediterranean, which might bring in Iran. What I'm saying here is a real possibility of global conflict here, let alone what's happening between Russia and the West over Ukraine. Can we actually stand today and allow Western leaders to go to Israel and to condemn absolutely what Hamas did, but to give carte blanche to the Israelis when they have stated openly they're going to cut off water, which in a few days could kill everyone in Gaza? I mean, there's been nothing so horrendous that Israelis have ever said in this long 70-year history that anyone could remember, that I could certainly remember. What message has to be sent to Western leaders right now?
The role of democratically elected leaders needs to be a global call for enormous restraint, a global call to the Israeli military to stop the bombing, stop the invasion. Remember here, one side is a modern state with a modern administrative arrangements, with a notionally democratic political culture, with one of the most powerful militaries in the world, backed up by a global superpower, and the other side are 2 million people without a defence force, without F-16 fighter planes, without the capacity to defend themselves, and they are being mercilessly and brutally attacked by one of the most powerful militaries in the world. How could we not be demanding restraint? How could we not be raising the fact that what we're seeing here are war crimes on a large scale? And how could we not be calling for restraint? And in the absence of restraint, actually placing significant repercussions against the Israeli state for this escalation of violence against the Palestinian people. 600,000 people, it's estimated, have fled their homes. They have nowhere to go. They may run out of food and water in days. And my government, the Australian government, has said nothing about restraint. The United States government has said nothing about restraint. The UK government has said nothing about restraint. How could that be?
Lee, would you like to add something to what we've been discussing?
Oh, it just makes me incredibly sad, I've got to say, on a personal level. I was in Palestine a few months ago. I've been there a number of times. I've been into Gaza once, and the thought of what they're doing, like terrible things happen in the world, and genocide is being committed on many communities, but now the world is watching. We've got no excuse. You know, David's outlined it very clearly, and I think we've all got to see how we can take action and put pressure on the leaders. Western leaders need to wake up to themselves, and history teaches us that it's when the public has a strong voice of anger, and at the moment that's certainly growing in Australia. And I'd encourage everybody to be talking to their friends, their workmates, their families, and picking up the phone and just telling their representatives that they have to change, like that they are complicit in one of the most horrendous war crimes we've actually ever seen, because we know it's happening. We have to act.
Yeah, and as David said, the world leaders need to loudly call for restraint on Israel. And we have had the German foreign minister going there and doing the opposite. We had Diana Johnstone speaking to us in detail about what happened with the German Greens, and I think we're going to play that now, Kathy. I want to thank...
Dimitri is here.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have our other guest. Must have just arrived. He did. Dimitri Lascaris, coming from Greece. I'm sorry, I was about to just shut down this interview, so you arrived in the nick of time. Can you hear me?
I can. Actually, I got here, and my sincere apologies. I had a little emergency, but I've been here since about 1:05, and I've had the benefit of hearing the excellent and insightful discussion. So,
well, can you add to that, please? We are talking, of course, about the history of the Green Movement, anti-war position being a major aspect of it. And we've seen the German Green Party moving away from that from 20 years ago and backing America's wars, Israeli war, etc. What about in Canada? How is the Canadian Green Party right now in terms of the question of peace and war? Is it still committed to the original principles of the Green Movement, or is it sort of aligning with the U.S. Democratic Party and with the German Greens?
The certainly aligned with the German Greens, and I think I have painfully experienced in a very personal way this struggle within the Green Movement between the so-called centrists and those who support the imperialistic and colonial policies of the United States government and its allies on the one hand, and those who are truly committed to the core values of the Green Party, which haven't been mentioned yet. And those core values are sustainability, nonviolence, social justice, respect for diversity, ecological wisdom, and participatory democracy. And I believe that those are the core values of all Green parties around the world, including the German Greens. And I've said many times as a Green that those values are inextricably intertwined. You can't have social justice without nonviolence. You can't have sustainability. You can't have participatory democracy without nonviolence. And sending lethal weaponry to Ukraine in a hot war zone when we ourselves provoke the war is the precise antithesis of nonviolence. Now, I said that, I was in a painful personal way, I've experienced this struggle. It started for me personally when I was appointed to the shadow cabinet of the Green Party of Canada by the current leader, Elizabeth May, in 2016. I was appointed as the justice critic. And I, at that time, for professional reasons, I'm a lawyer, I had to go to Israel to interview some witnesses in a class action that I was pursuing here against a Canadian mining company. And I took the opportunity at the end of that trip to tour the West Bank. I was guided by a Palestinian Canadian artist by the name of Rehab Nazal, who had been shot by an Israeli sniper 6 months earlier in the West Bank while she was peacefully photographing an Israeli skunk truck. What I saw so appalled me that when I came back to Canada, I had to take action. And just to clarify, what I saw is not nearly as bad as what is happening today in the West Bank, and certainly nowhere near as bad as what's happening to Gaza. What I did when I came back in my capacity as justice critic was I brought forward a resolution calling for the Green Party of Canada to support the BDS movement. Immediately, the leader, Elizabeth May, opposed me, even though I was a member of her own shadow cabinet. And in the convention that year in August in Ottawa, the nation's capital, to my great surprise, the party members adopted this resolution over the vigorous objections of the leader. The next day, she threatened to resign. And with effectively a political gun to its head, the federal council of our party decided to convene another emergency meeting to give the members an opportunity to rescind the decision that they had made to support the BDS movement. Over the next 3 months, I think it became, before that emergency meeting happened, it became quite clear to, I think, Elizabeth May and to those who supported her that the numbers were not there for her to achieve the outcome she wanted. And so she negotiated a compromise resolution with me. The so-called compromise resolution removed the acronym BDS, but was in all other respects substantively the same, and in fact contained new provisions calling, for example, for Israel to be hauled before the International Criminal Court. And so we were the only party in Canada at that stage, the only party that had a policy, a formal policy, member approved, calling for Israel to be subjected to some form of sanction for its unspeakable crimes. So we fast forward to 2020, Elizabeth May resigned. After 13 years in the position of leader, and a leadership contest was called. I threw my hat into the ring and did so explicitly on an eco-socialist platform. And one of the planks of my platform was Canada's withdrawal from NATO. And of course, a complete ban on the sale of weapons to human rights violators, including but not limited to Israel. And I was opposed by 7 other candidates, one of whom was a centrist, and I think fair to say a Zionist. Her name was Annamie Paul, and she was explicitly supported by the leader, Elizabeth May. And you don't have to take my word for that, because Elizabeth May admitted it in an op-ed in the Toronto Star afterwards, that she had supported her. And I ended up finishing second with 45% of the vote on the eighth and final ballot, and Annamie Paul won. Within 4 months of her becoming the leader, Israel began attacking Gaza to a much smaller degree than it has attacked Gaza within the past week. And two of our MPs, we had 3 MPs in the Parliament of Canada at that time. 2 of our MPs, not Elizabeth May, came out and quite properly condemned Israel as an apartheid state. At that point, the spokesperson of the leader, Annamie Paul, who I think it's fair to say was a fanatical Zionist, fanatically committed to Israel, called both of our own MPs anti-Semites in the Canadian press. So we had this extraordinary spectacle of the spokesperson of the leader of the Green Party of Canada accusing 2 MPs of the Green Party of Canada of anti-Semitism because they had called Israel an apartheid state. This caused an enormous, as you can imagine, division within the party. And one of these MPs, Jenica Atwin, ended up defecting to another party. The other MP was defeated 6 months later with the assistance, I should say, of Annamie Paul's spokesperson. And by the way, she refused to fire him when he accused our 2 own MPs of being anti-Semites. And in the following election, some 6 months later, the Green Party of Canada achieved its lowest result in the entire year, at the time since Elizabeth May became the leader back in 2006. By far, we were reduced to 2% of the popular vote, and we lost MPs. Annamie Paul then resigned a month later, and another leadership contest was held, and I was presented with the opportunity to run, and frankly, I declined. Because at that point, I was so disenchanted with what I was seeing within the Green Party, and the party had been so damaged, and the, frankly, political environment for speaking honestly about these issues had become so oppressive that I chose, rather than to enter the political ring and be confronted with those choices that my colleagues talked about, those painful choices between compromise and principle, I decided to remain independent. I'm still a Green, but I decided to remain independent in terms of my public advocacy. And now we come to the current atrocity or series of atrocities. And I think it bears pointing out that within the space of a week, Israel has not only begun to starve a civilian population, approximately 1/2 of whom are children, but it has also killed over 1,000 Palestinian children, more than twice, I believe, the number it killed in 2014, which was up until now the deadliest assault it had launched against Gaza since the blockade began. It has bombed hospitals. It has bombed civilian convoys. It has killed UN staffers. It has killed 2 reporters on the border in Lebanon. And I frankly, I'm trying to rack my brain for an atrocity that Israel has not committed within the space of 7 days, with the, I think it's fair to say, enthusiastic support of Western governments. The Green Party has been co-opted. The Green Party of Canada has been co-opted. I can't speak for my colleagues in Australia or in all countries, but I can say that certainly in Canada and in Germany, that is crystal clear. The Green Party has been co-opted by forces of neoconservatism and neoliberalism. Up until now, we on the left, the eco-socialists, I'm sad to say, have lost that battle, although we continue to fight. And the only way forward, I think, especially, I'll speak for my own country, it's not enough at this stage for people on the left to be making demands of our politicians. You know, and I'll go back to a story I've heard Chris Hedges tell a couple of times. He talks about an excerpt from the autobiography of Henry Kissinger. I myself could not bring myself to read Henry Kissinger's autobiography, so I'm going to take Chris Hedges' word for it. But he tells the story of an interaction that Mr. Kissinger had with Richard Nixon at the height of the Vietnam War protests, where they were standing in the White House looking out on the irate throngs, you know, clamoring over buses that had been put in front of the White House. And according to Chris, Nixon turned to Kissinger and said, "Henry, they're coming to get us." And it wasn't long after that the United States government finally brought an end to that monstrous war. I think that what we need to do at this stage is to get into the streets. We need to be angry, not in a violent way, of course, but we need to come out in large numbers. We must be relentless. We must peacefully express our rage and our indignation to the point where we begin to inspire fear in the hearts of Western leaders. They can stop this. It's entirely within their power to stop this. And ultimately, they hold the key to peace. And if we inspire just enough fear by peaceful means in their hearts, I think we can finally begin to move down the path of justice for the beleaguered Palestinian people.
Yeah, it seems, Dimitri, that there's this frightening obedience that we're seeing displayed in parliaments around the world and in parties like the Greens, who shouldn't be obedient to these matters when it comes to their position on war. But if you can briefly explain, how did this happen in Canada? Was it purely indigenous reasons, influence from the U.S., from Germany, or somewhere else? How did this come about that the Green Party has been co-opted, as you said?
Well, I think it has to do with political financing. People. So, for example, we have to report our campaign contributions. Those of us who ran to be the leader, and I and others examined the campaign contributions for Annemie Paul in the 2020 leadership contest. And a number of people who are known in Canada, quite wealthy people, known to be quite aggressive in their Zionism, made the maximum political contribution to Annemie Paul. And these are people who had no history of having contributed to the Green Party of Canada before. So it certainly has something to do with political financing. It has to do something with the structure of our media industry. So for example, I was pilloried when I ran explicitly as an eco-socialist and called for the Canadian government to withdraw Canada from NATO by the mainstream corporate press. I had a very different reaction from the independent, not-for-profit media. But effectively, anybody who criticizes the neoconservative, neoliberal policies of the Canadian government is going to confront extraordinary obstacles from the mainstream corporate media. And you have a lot of people in the politics today, and I'm sad to say that Elizabeth May, I believe, is one of them, who fears the wrath of the corporate media. And I would draw attention to one particular thing, which I think is really sort of instructive. And it has to do, I believe, with an article you wrote, Joe, for Consortium News, when I think it was some organization, some propagandistic organization called NewsGuard, took issue with Consortium News coverage of the Ukraine war. And you had to lay out in extraordinary detail the evidentiary support for the claim that I and many others and you made that this war was provoked. And it was remarkable. I read your article a couple of times, and I was just struck by the fact that how, in the face of so much evidence, how is it that the corporate media could say with a straight face that this war was not provoked? But they're able to do it. And ultimately, there's a simple reason for that. They are not there to serve the public interest. They're there to serve the interest of their owners, as all for-profit corporations do. So that's the obstacle that we confront. But at the end of the day, I think I agree with my colleagues from Australia that what's the point of being in power if at the end of the day you're going to sacrifice your principles? You may as well find another way to contribute.
I'd like to bring David in and leave to have anything to add.
Well, look, I think there are a number of matters to sort of raise. I don't know the history of the Canadian Greens, and I'm not going to pass comment on the history of the Canadian Greens Party. I do know that there's been powerful solidarity for the Palestinian people from the New Zealand Greens, who are, I'm much more familiar with the work they've been doing. Powerful solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I think though that we could have an argument one way or another about Ukraine, or we could have an argument about other conflicts. I think if you're going to be genuinely committed to peace and non-violence, then you need to apply that uniformly. Wars of aggression, acts of unprovoked violence need to be condemned and called out if you're going to be consistent on a peace and non-violent platform. And I think that's been some of the power in what I've seen from some of the strongest pro-Palestine advocates, thousands of whom, as I said, who gathered in Sydney only very recently. They are humanising conflict. They are calling out, not on some sort of false equivalence in terms of the scale and the cause. And I think you can make a mistake of false equivalence on scale and cause, but you can have empathy and you can condemn the killings of civilians and innocents and children on both sides of a conflict, and you can do it with a common humanity. And we should, if we're committed to peace and non-violence, do that with a common humanity. And in doing that, search for the root causes of that violence, search for the root causes of those conflict, and focus our attention on removing the root causes of those conflict at the same time. And that's a kind of subtlety that is, should be a kind of obvious statement. You can have a common humanity with those, victims of violence, and also at the same time search for a political solution and look to the historical causes of the violence. That shouldn't be that complicated, but somehow or another that can be you can be deeply attacked when you take that position. And I think that's what is needed right now with this conflict: a common humanity, but a clear-eyed political analysis and historical analysis of the root causes of those violence. And of course, that should unite us all in a call to an end of the occupation and to demanding rights of the Palestinian people, at the same time as we are appalled by Israeli civilian deaths and appalled by Palestinian civilian deaths. And you can do that without falsely having an equivalence between the violence.
Lee?
Look, it's a critical time for humanity. This war could expand. It could engulf so many people. And I think it's a critical time for the Greens too, because being frank about it, I've been in the party since 1990. I've seen a growth in electoral success that I had not expected to see in my lifetime. We have had people elected to the lower house, which means you need to get more than 50% of the vote. But what goes with that is danger, and that danger is his parliamentarism that we've talked about before. And we can still make this wonderful contribution if we don't go down that dangerous path that we've seen so often, particularly with the Social Democrats. You've talked about the German Greens, etc. How do we avoid that? I think as Greens, we really need to be identifying with the problems that people confront. And this, what I'm about to say, directly does the dots go very clearly back to the need to build a global peace movement to stand with the people of Palestine. So what I find so tragic, and before I mention how our Greens parties, from what I can see, certainly not just in Australia, around the world, fairly identify with working class people. We do take up some issues that would make a real difference to working class lives, but still there's a fracture there. And I think that we've really got to work on this, because so many of those people, they're often, some people describe themselves, journalists use the term, they're left behind. They've gone to Trump, they've gone to Brexit, etc. We've just had this tragic situation in Australia where we literally voted against First Nations people getting recognition. And why does that come about? It comes about for a whole range of reasons. And I think these cost of living pressures that people are feeling, unless we can stand with them on the issues around, the impossibility to get secure housing, to have fair wages in your work, all those things that matter to people about how they raise their children, etc. If we stand with them on issues that matter to them, they're more likely to get back to issues of international solidarity. I do believe these issues are interconnected, and this is where I think the Greens can play a critical role if we can use our parliamentary position. And I do congratulate David. He does a lot of international work where he works with these communities. He takes their message into Parliament, speaks about them, moves motions, and then he's back on the streets with them. And that activism, parliamentary activism, I think will be critical to our success. And it's where the Greens can make a contribution to building a global peace movement that is absolutely critical to assist the people of Palestine. They're doing everything they can to save lives of their fellow Palestinians. But my goodness me, what we're seeing, I've never seen anything like it. I've read about it, but to see it on the television, what we watch, it's enormous. So it's good to talk together about it, and I hope we can get our parties on track to make these contributions.
Well, can I just make one observation? When, I have worked for many years with Leanne, have enormous respect for her politics and for her principles. But I do want to say there are now 15 Greens in the federal parliament in Australia, which is a record number of Greens for us. And we have been united on this position in the face of some, significant external pressure. We've been united on the position that we've adopted in the parliament. And we've had my Greens colleagues and myself and others attending rallies in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And we have at the same time been campaigning on, I think, some of the critical material issues facing at least Australians, the centre of which is the right to have a safe and secure home. And building those connections, I hope, between campaigns on the ground, connections with Multicultural Australia, material needs and material conditions, and sticking to our principles. Now, are you going to be perfect in that in a parliamentary democracy? You're not. The nature of a parliamentary democracy means you end up working with people like the Labor Party and others as best you can. And there will always be an element of, compromise in getting the numbers needed in a parliamentary democracy. I hope that some of the constraints we have on that compromise are remaining connected with movements on the ground, remaining connected with union movements, remaining connected with global peace movements, remaining connected with struggles for Palestinian justice and other justice, and maintaining those connections outside of Parliament. But it is a real struggle, Joe, and the very fact of parliamentary democracy pushes you into positions of compromise, sometimes essential for material gains, but it's something you need to keep a constant eye out for.
Dimitri, we could close with you before we listen to Diana Johnstone to give us the real details of what happened in the history of the German Green Party, why it happened, what it did. What kind of damage you think the German Greens are doing, in particular Annalena Baerbock, to not only the Green Party movement around the world, but to the world?
I think Ms. Baerbock has done immense damage to the Green Party. She's certainly conveyed the impression they are the most prominent Green Party in the world and have been since they entered this coalition government with Olaf Scholz. And she's conveying the impression to the global left and to the global south, where we haven't, as a party, as a movement, made as many inroads, that we have absolutely no commitment whatsoever to nonviolence, despite the Global Greens Charter. And that we have been completely co-opted by the military-industrial complex. That's the impression that she's conveying, and her colleagues, Mr. Habeck and others. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The greatest favor that the German Greens can do to the global green movement is to change their name, because they're besmirching us all. And the last thing I want to say is I certainly agree that we should apply the principles of nonviolence and international law universally. We shouldn't simply point the finger at Israel, but we should be equally diligent in applying the law to all violators of international law and humanitarian law. But I would also say that our primary responsibility is the actions of our own governments and those governments with which our governments have allied our countries. We pay our taxes here, we vote here, they purport to speak in our name. It is in our own countries where we have the right to vote, where we can make the greatest difference. And so we should be focusing on the crimes of our governments and our supposed allies first and foremost.
Thank you, Dimitri, for that. We're going to go shortly to Diana Johnstone's interview. Now, I wanted to thank Dimitri and Lee and David. And I think Kathy has something she wants to say, our producer.
Not yet.
Okay. So let's move on to Diana Johnstone's interview that we did earlier. And again, thank you all three very much for your input on this crucial issue that gets more crucial by the day as we see the unfolding events. And don't forget Ukraine. That is far from over, that war. Thank you again very much.
Thanks very much. See you later.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Joining us now from Paris is Diana Johnstone, an American journalist who's a very keen observer of European politics. She's lived in France and elsewhere in Europe for many, many
Can you hear me?
years. And she also worked for a time
just,
as the spokesperson for
Can
the
you hear me? Can they
Green
hear me?
Group in the European Parliament. Thank you,
Yeah.
Diana, for joining us here on
So
CN
maybe
Live.
some
It's good to
words
have
of
you back.
encouragement.
Well, it's good to talk to you.
I've been So we're talking
to
about
Johnstone,
the evolution of the Green
and in
Party,
fact,
and you had a
she is
front row seat
considering
with the Green Group and the
running.
European Parliament. Tell us a little bit about your time there.
No, she said this is
what
okay.
Did you
This is
see
public
of the Green
information.
Party
She
at
is
that
considering
time that's different from today?
running.
Oh, well, I watched the
That's all.
beginning of the
Okay.
Green Group. I had a
Thank you very much.
there in Bonn
Bye.
to see
I know.
the Greens come into the German Bundestag, and I got to know them then. And then I became the press officer for the Green Group, that is all of the Green parties in the European Parliament at the end of '89. And so I watched the evolution. And when I joined, at first, I was interested in the Greens because they were an anti-war party. In fact, that's what attracted me to them. And then I saw, especially in the European Parliament, I saw the change. And there were individuals who took a big role in that change. And that was some rather, not the early Greens, not the ones who founded the party, but who joined. In Frankfurt, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was famous in France for his role in the May '68 uprising, and Joschka Fischer, who had been a sort of street fighter in Frankfurt. And they became identified by the press, especially, as the realists in the Greens. And this evolution, I want to start off by saying that the press, the media, played a role in this evolution, because the media created sort of this conflict in the Greens between the realos, the realists, and the fundamentalists, fundis. And the fundamentalists were those who wanted to stick to the principles of the Greens. And the realists were, well, what realism really meant was making enough compromises that we can get into a government coalition. That's what realism means in a country like Germany, where the government is by coalition. Now, of course, in the United States, that temptation doesn't exist because of the political setup. But in a country which is governed by coalitions, the temptation is right there to make whatever compromises are necessary to get into a governing coalition. And that's what realo really meant. And the media, the German media, picked out on Joschka Fischer was elected to the parliament, and they would say, oh, his speeches are wonderful, he's great, he's wonderful. So they built him up as a great figure, although he was not a founder. And as a matter of fact, he was never much of an environmentalist or a peace person, but he was sort of spectacular. And then what happened what I saw in the European Parliament, it all happened with the problem in Yugoslavia, with the conflict in Yugoslavia. Now, at first, the Green Group, the person responsible for the international policy was someone elected in the Italian Green Group, Alexander Langer, who came from Alto Adige, South Tyrol, a place of mixed German and Italian. So he was very sensitive to the problems of ethnic mixes. And Alexander was one of those people, and he was not the only, who was sponsoring groups between intellectuals in different groups in Yugoslavia in order to find a peace compromise. And these meetings, I attended them, and I attended some that other people had too. There was definitely a possibility of finding a compromise in Yugoslavia. And Alexander was somebody who was pursuing this effort. And
The pursuit of a compromise, you say, over the Yugoslavia crisis. You thought there was one.
And in July of 1995, Alexander Langer tragically died of a very strange suicide. And the question came up in the Green group of replacing him. And at that time, Danny Cohn-Bendit, who was a fairly new member of the group, said it'll be me. And he bid to be the replacement. And I remember terribly well that meeting in the Green group, where Danny Cohn-Bendit said, well, I know that a lot of you don't agree with me, but if you talk to the media, they'll pay no attention. But everything I say, the media takes up. So that's why you should choose me, because the media listens to me. And stunningly, he was elected against another German who came from East Germany, who was a peace person. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't even the Germans who gave him the majority, but he got the majority, and he became then the spokesman for the Green group in foreign policy. And he was wanted to get out into a war against the wicked Serbs. And so that began a change within the European Greens, and the Germans were the most influential. And of course, then later in 1998, when there was this trouble in Kosovo, which was very much distorted in the media, there was a left government in Bonn where Joschka Fischer was chosen as foreign minister. That was the comrade of Danny Cohn-Bendit, who followed the Cohn-Bendit line. And at that time, it's very strange. The media was one influence. The other influence was the United States. Because actually, and it became very clear as when time went on, Joschka Fischer had become the pet of the American political establishment. Now, this is very remarkable because Richard Holbrooke, who was mainly responsible for Yugoslav policy, said publicly before Fischer became foreign minister, he will make a great foreign minister. Now, that is surprising for somebody who hadn't even finished high school, who had been a street fighter, who was not educated or prepared in any way to be foreign minister. And here comes Holbrooke saying, he will be a great foreign minister. Well, he was a foreign minister who was totally for the war.
How did Fischer get into the Green Party, Green politics, as well as Cohn-Bendit? How did they both get in? Do you know?
Well, they just said they wanted to be in. And since they were both kind of notorious, and you see, you've got to realize the Green Party was a great social elevator at that time. Sort of anybody could get in. You didn't have to go through much testing because it was a small growing party. So you want to be in and you're famous, come right in and you can run for parliament. And it happened just as easily as that. And
no vetting to see, that they were going against one of the four pillars of the Green movement, which was nonviolence or anti-war. Nobody knew that when they came in.
No, because the media paid attention to them.
So basically, the pursuit of power, political power, is what ruined the Greens at that moment. And the rest of the party members who didn't agree with them were intimidated by both of these men or did not stand up to them because they may have wanted power as well.
And there was a meeting of the Greens when this was going on, of the German Greens. And there were people who were very much, there was a woman, trade unionist, who was very, very much against the Fischer line and was going back to the peace line. And Fischer made a speech defending his line on the theme that there must never, because the German slogan had been never against war from coming out from Germany. And he said, no, the slogan is never again Auschwitz. So he went back to the Holocaust religion, because it is a religion. It's become a total religion. I mean, you can't say anything against it if you go to jail. That becomes a sort of state religion. And so he's never again Auschwitz. Well, a lot of the more peaceful Greens left the party at that time, as a matter of fact. But the war went on, and Fischer became, by the way, he then had an extraordinary career under the wing of Madeleine Albright, who brought him into the consultancy business, which has made him a millionaire. He's become very rich as a consultant.
Of course, Albright had a big role in the Yugoslav conflict, as Holbrooke did. I knew both of them at the UN at that time. So that had to do with the Yugoslav. That's where they came together then, right? Albright and
it was. And you see, what happened around then is you have this fight between values. Anti-war had been the value of the left since the Vietnam War. And then the US promoted another value, human rights. And of course, no more Auschwitz is human rights. So human rights trumped anti-war as your leading value. You mustn't prevent war, although war is where the human rights violations happen, including the Holocaust, by the way. It's the wars that produce all these human rights violations. But the idea became, we must have a war to prevent these things from happening, to prevent genocide, to prevent Auschwitz. So you make up there's going to be a genocide. You say, they're going to commit a genocide. So we've got to go and bomb them to death. And this idea of
responsibility to protect, R2P.
Yeah, the human rights, you see that the Nobel Peace Prize is practically never given for peace. It's given for human rights. Human rights has become the dominant value of the West, not peace. No. Human rights, which can be the opposite of peace, because we have to make war on behalf of human rights. And that's the way it's worked out. And then there's another slight element that comes in with the Germans. And that I also observed in the parliament. To my great surprise, Germans who have been on the left, social democrats and so on, that had been in the peace movement of the 80s, all of a sudden, when the enemy was Serbia, there was something atavistic that happened, because Serbia was the enemy of Germany in World War I. And the peace movement had been slogan, we mustn't have any more enemy stereotypes of people we had war. All of a sudden, they jumped on the stereotypes against the Serbs. And now you see it against the Russians in a big way. This was sort of, the war against Yugoslavia was an exercise to prepare for breaking up Russia, which is what they're trying to do now, as a matter of fact. With Serbia being the role of Russia, and then the other nationalities try to get them against the main one in order to break up the country. This strategy of breaking up an enemy country by considering that minorities are victims of human rights violations. See, that's the whole theme. If the minorities have leaders who claim to be oppressed, well, we must support them and break up the country. And that's the scenario.
And of course, Diana, it's only the human rights violations of conveniently the enemies of the United States and the West. For example, human rights violations by the Saudis or the Israelis or Pinochet, for example. Well, that was excused. It was only the human rights violations of Russia and China, etc. That's the hypocrisy of it, isn't it?
Of course, because there are all sorts of countries that have ethnic minorities and so on, but it's only the ones that we target that because they are not obedient to our world order, the rules-based order, meaning the rules that we set at a particular time. Well, it's those that are targeted. It's totally according to the tête du client. It depends on which country it is, but particularly Yugoslavia was seen as a kind of miniature Soviet Union, which was very miniature, very much smaller. And so they used the techniques to break it up that then they didn't use against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was broken up by its own elite. By the way, it wasn't this at all. It was broken up by its own elites who decided they could get richer in a different way. But it's now used against Russia, you see, with Ukraine and so on. Because now there's all these projects to break Russia into pieces.
Yeah.
And that's totally on the Yugoslav model.
Now, in a couple of years later, in 2001, the Greens were again in a coalition government in Germany, and they agreed with Schroeder. Gerhard Schroeder was the chancellor to back the 2001 Afghan war, to have Germany. What role did Germany play in the Afghan war after 9/11, and what about the German Greens then? And what was the reaction from other Green parties in Europe and around the world to that?
They pretty much followed this human rights versus anti-war. To my amazement, I mean, people that were my friends, for instance, in the Finnish Greens, they end up going along with it. I can't tell because I know what goes on. I know a few countries personally. I know Belgium personally. I know France personally. I know Germany and Italy. The other countries I have not lived in. I'm not sure exactly how this happens, but the fact is that the German Greens were the first ones, and the great success, you see, look at the success of Joschka Fischer. He has honorary degrees from universities. He's never got through high school. He's a millionaire consultant. Wow, you see, I mean, that's a career. He had a marvelous career. You don't get that kind of career being a peacenik, you know?
Right.
You just don't.
So in 2001, Germany sent over 4,000 troops to Afghanistan. I think this had to be the first deployment outside of Germany of German troops, was it not? I'm trying to remember.
Well, they were sort of marginally involved in Yugoslavia in the air or some things like that. But then this opened the dam. From then on, whenever, well, it's true that Germany did stay out of the
Iraq invasion, that's correct, yeah.
They
voted against it in the Security Council.
That was the government. That wasn't the Greens. I'm not sure the Greens might have gone along.
Maybe the Greens would have wanted to get involved in Iraq. It's interesting.
I don't know about that because it wasn't, they didn't have anything to do with that. So, but the fact is that the Greens have been for everything on the name of human rights. And
what happened after that between 2001 and leading up to today's government, where the Greens play a big role in the coalition with the Social Democrats, and the foreign minister, as we know, became Annalena Baerbock, the leader of the Green Party, with Robert Habeck as the economy minister. Tell us about the rise of these two figures and what that means for the Green Party in Germany and the reaction of Greens around the world to those two.
Look, I can't quite explain this, but I would like to call attention to the fact that Germany has been a militarily occupied country for over 75 years. Germany is militarily occupied, and this occupation takes many forms. The German economy is heavily influenced by U.S. investments. The Marshall Plan sort of arranged so that U.S. investments would be favored in European countries, and Germany most of all. And so, for instance, BlackRock has a huge stake, perhaps, in the German arms industry. So it's when Germany makes weapons, as it's now planning to do more and more, the profits go to shareholders in BlackRock. So Germany is influenced by U.S. investments. It's influenced by all kinds of foundations and the Marshall Plan, this and the and the Atlantic Buca, and all of these who vet young people who are the future leaders. And the leadership of Germany, both in the media and politics, is heavily, directly influenced by the United States. Now, they have similar things in other countries, but Germany is the most thoroughly occupied of the countries, added to the fact that there's an ethnic harmony between Germany and the United States, which doesn't exist with France or Italy. The French don't feel Americans and the Americans don't feel French, but Germans and Americans, since the majority of European settlers in the United States are German. The United States is full of German customs, German food, German ethnic people, and the Germans find it quite easy to be American, which other Europeans don't. And the soldiers that go to Germany love being in Germany. They feel practically at home. There's beer and there's sausages and stuff like that. And so there's this occupation. The Americans occupy other countries, but there's not quite the harmony. There's not quite the ease of the occupation of other countries as with Germany because of this ethnic factor.
And how did Baerbock get her start? Can you tell us? Where did she come from?
She went to school and she spent time in the United States in school, and then also in England, where she greatly exaggerated her accomplishments. She said she had a degree when she didn't. And even with that, she didn't learn English as well as most Germans I've seen. I mean, so I don't think she's terribly bright, because despite all this exposition to the English language, she hasn't mastered it particularly well at all. As I say, Germans generally learn English quite easily. And I saw latest poll shows that school children in Germany are getting worse in German and better in English. So the Americanization of Germany is well underway. But with this substrata of revenge against Russia, because part of being with America is we can sort of give a new happy ending to World War II by being on the good side. You see, a lot of Germans don't like decades of being on the bad side, of being the bad guys. And now they're on the good side because they're with the Americans against the bad Putin Russians. And this is an element, again, which is psychological. But these psychological elements can help explain why Germany has accepted policies that go straight against its own economic interests, which is kind of a mystery because they're ruining their own industry. They're raising their own energy prices. They're making policies that are against their own interests. But there's some kind of subjective satisfaction. I'm talking about leadership people because there's a lot of opposition to this policy, but it's being very repressed, even legally. You know, laws that are say if you justify or just explain the Russian position, you are apologizing for a crime and you can be arrested for that.
You wrote an article for Consortium News, originally for us, in May of 2021. And you wrote that next September, that would be 2021, the Germans will hold parliamentary elections, which will decide who is to be the next chancellor succeeding Angela Merkel. Now, in foreign policy, the choice may be between pragmatism and moral posturing, and it is now not clear which will prevail. Aggressive self-righteousness has its candidate, Annalena Baerbock, chosen by the Green Party to be the next chancellor. Baerbock's virtue signaling starts with scolding Russia. She was only 40 years old, you wrote, a year younger than the Green Party itself. Of course, the Greens didn't win, and she became foreign minister instead of chancellor. You were identifying her. That's the first I'd ever heard of her when you wrote that article for us. She was only 40, and she has played a very, very aggressive role in the war in Ukraine. I mean, tell us a little bit about that. And she's a Green and totally betraying the origins of the Green Party and what many Greens around the world still believe in.
No, she's the total opposite of Petra Kelly or something. She has a very simple-minded, moralistic view of we're the good, we are the good, they are the bad, and it's very simple. There's nothing diplomatic about her as a foreign minister. She just goes in and tells people what they should be doing, and you know, Habeck has made a sort of the sentences about how we lead by serving, sort of the idea. I think behind that he's meaning we're leading Europe by serving the United States.
Right.
We become the leader in Europe by being the best servants of the United States, and that's a little what this government is trying to do. Where although Scholz is the prime minister, the Greens' influence is overwhelming in this government, and the whole thrust of this government is now Germany is, after all, we are the biggest country here. Germany is becoming the leader by being the #1 follower of the United States. That's the thrust of it. And Habeck said that going to Washington, and Annalena makes such statements also. You know, the main thing is we are together forever with the United States and with Ukraine. You know, it's just, and of course the anti-Russian hysteria is really quite sickening. Really quite sickening.
Yeah, the article, the headline of that article was Washington. That you wrote Washington's green branches in Europe. And you said the Greens are in perfect in Germany are in perfect harmony with the Biden administration's new ideological crusade to remake the world on the American model, echoing Russiagate, and with no evidence, the Greens accuse Russia of malevolent interference in Europe. So you're basically saying that they have totally been captured by the U.S., the Green Party, as opposed to the Social Democrats. They're also in Germany kowtowing to Washington too, aren't they?
Well, I mean, we sort of helped set up the Christian Democrats.
Yeah.
So, but then I will say I was going to say that the problem is that the polls show, and midterm elections here and there show that the Greens are losing support
In Germany.
in Germany, and the alternative for Germany, which is demonized as far right, is gaining, and it's gaining, especially but not entirely, not exclusively in East Germany.
Right.
And the Greens are losing support. I would say for two reasons, partly because of their war policy, but also because, and I have to bring this up to our Green friends in other places, also because there is a kind of backlash brewing against Green environmental policies, because these policies, in fact, are, because now certain things are not working, and they're working very much against ordinary people. So I think that there is going to be, I see brewing a certain revolt, because initially green was sort of such a good word, you know, anything that's green has got to be good. But once you put it into concrete policies that begin to make people uncomfortable here and there, it loses that luster of virtue. And I will warn people that these green agenda things, which are very much in harmony with the World Economic Forum, rather than being original progressive policies, are running into opposition in popular complaints, you would say. And so if I can speak a bit about that.
Yeah.
Because I would say that the revolt is brewing against the green agenda in 3 areas. Well, to start with, you have to see that the green agenda has been based on a very narrow idea of environmental policies. It's been based on the idea that we can prevent global warming, for which we personally are responsible, by reducing CO2 emissions. So it's been a policy of preventing global warming, which perhaps we can't, by the way, because there are factors like the sun which play a role, rather than adapting. And also it ignores other aspects of the environment. It's so concentrated on that, and that means it has been particular policies. And there are 3 areas where there is really growing discontent. One is energy, of course, the cost of energy. The fact in Germany, the windmills simply haven't worked. They simply have not managed to provide the energy. So Germany stopped its nuclear. Now, nuclear power does not have CO2 emissions. And
Right.
Germany, and so the German Green campaign against nuclear energy has stopped nuclear energy. The windmills have not been able to provide it. And so Germany is actually, with the Green government, going back to coal.
Yeah.
And using more coal. So there's something wrong there in this energy policy. It's not working. And in France, there's considerable discontent because France had cheap energy due to its nuclear industry. Germany, via the European Union, has done everything to sabotage the French nuclear and force the French to buy energy on the same prices that the Germans have to pay. And that's causing quite a lot of discontent in France. So this energy business seems to be quite confused. And then there's a question of transport, where people are they are supposed to use electric cars, which most people cannot afford. There's again there are contradictions. They're building new highways, although they're saying people can't drive. Nothing has ever been done to make train traffic to promote that. So there's something in the policy that just doesn't add up. And then there's housing, and that's going to cause a lot of trouble because the European Union regulations, which now are coming down all over the place, are going to, I see this in France because this affects me. They are going to make it impossible to rent housing which isn't properly insulated. And they have this. Well, it so happens that Paris is full of very small apartments, and a lot of middle-class people own a little apartment like that. And the cost of insulation, as they said it, is something that such owners can't afford. So they'll have to be met. They're going to take millions of apartments off the market with this. And there's already a housing shortage. So you have these 3 aspects of green policy. And meanwhile, fossil fuels are being squandered on wars. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the wars can, they just use it up just like that.
Well, that's interesting. The green pro-war policy is hurting its environmental argument. And I want to ask you about the Nord Stream pipeline. When it blew up, it was one of the worst, if not the worst, release of methane gas in history in one incident. And what did the Green Party say about that? I don't remember them saying too much at all, did they?
No, they're nothing. But and they seem quite happy about that because they didn't want to. They were against it. and so you see, there's too much incoherence in this.
Yeah.
This green policy. So it's not making sense to people, really. It's not making sense. And so I think this will have electoral effects. I think Greens elsewhere should think carefully about all of, not just follow whatever is being said, globally, but you should, really think about what environmental policy should be to be really progressive and good for people and popular, because these things are just coming down in an authoritative way with the whole attitude is you're the fault, you're destroying the planet, it's your fault, and you can't get a receipt from your store anymore because we're saving the planet, but they're squandering everything on big wars. Ça va pas.
Let me, before we go, Diana, I want to ask you about France and the French Green Party. First of all, you talked about the nuclear energy, the cost of energy going up in France from mostly nuclear, and one of the reasons, of course, is they've lost they're losing the cheap uranium from Niger after the rebellion there, the coup, and the rejection of the French in Niger. This is a quite interesting development. How does that impact the German energy costs, and what is the state of the French Green Party right now as well? Are they going the route of the Germans, or are they still holding on to some progressive views when it comes to war and peace?
No, not at all. In fact, in the French policy, the French NUPES, it's called, this coalition of the left, the Green Party the French Green is in that. And it's now in the state of rupture because Mélenchon, who is head of the Insoumis, one of the groups, has not condemned Hamas as a terrorist, an unprovoked attack on Israel. And so the others in the left are moving away from him. And the Greens, of course, are among those who are moving away from him. So that what is going on, what is very likely to happen is that this Hamas war is helping France move toward a right-wing government in the next election. I'll explain why. In the 80s, Mitterrand very cleverly, when he moved away from the common program with the communists, which was a left-wing program in order to conform to the European thing, took up anti-racism as the theme and branded the National Front of Le Pen as an extreme right that is outside of the decent Republican arc. So you see what that meant was that the Republican right could never make a coalition with Le Pen, so that the left would have to win the elections. Now the opposite is happening. There's a whole move to say that Mélenchon is the one that's outside the Republican because he's Islamo-gauchism, he's Islamo-leftist, he's a boy. And that will mean that the left can never have a coalition that can win. So you're having this pro-Israel attitude, which is fanatic here. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Including Le Pen, right? Including Le Pen. What? Marine Le Pen as well.
Oh, exactly. So she's she's okay now because she's going along with that. So now the idea is that she's included and Mélenchon's the outsider. So now it'll be all right to have a right-wing coalition with the far right, but it won't be all right to have a left-wing coalition with the far left because of Israel.
You know, I
Because
interviewed Marine Le Pen about 7 years ago, around 2015 in New York. She was there, and we spoke for an hour. Well, and I was shocked by her views about Israel and the Palestinians. Her father may have been called an anti-Semite, but she is certainly very pro-Israel. She really did not. She's an Islamophobe, and that's the thing that really disturbed me the most about talking to her. And so it's very clear now what you're saying. It's quite interesting. She can be catapulted into power because of the war in Israel. However, they don't like her views on Russia, though, do they? The establishment in France, they don't like.
No. Well, actually, there are a lot of people in France, including military and other people who do like her views, but she's hardly dared to say them anyway. I mean, she's been rather quiet about that because, but she's not the most right wing, because there's Zemmour has come along, and he's more fanatic about this than she is, which makes her look relatively okay. So in fact, that because there's someone to her right who is more extreme against Muslims, she's not. She's a little bit but she's for Israel. But the fact is, so was Le Pen. That was all exaggerated. I mean, there was never any proof that he was anti-Semitic, in fact.
Right.
I mean, he made one remark which he was sued for and had to pay huge fines for, when he simply said that the gas chambers were a detail of World War II. And he was fined twice for that. But once he said, well, if it's not so, then World War II was a detail of the gas chambers. Well, as a matter of fact, that's what a lot of people believe.
So, Diane, thank you very much for being with us. And is there any hope now for the Greens in the future? Where might it go from here? In France, in Germany, around the world?
I think that they are so. I think Annalena Baerbock has dug their grave, as far as I'm concerned, as in Europe, and maybe one should find another label. I don't know, because certainly she has gone very, very far with this, and her party has gone along with her, and the European Greens have gone along with her. And of course, it has nothing to do with the Greens in the United States. I realize that, but it's very difficult. I think it puts all Green movements in a difficult position.
All right. Thank you, Diana Johnstone, joining us from Paris today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Palestine will be free.
Palestine will be free!
If you didn't hear or know about the Greens' policy on Palestine that was recently released just a couple of months ago, your homework tonight is to go home and read it and find out. Because there is a party out there in Australia that supports Palestine 100%. This policy was recognized globally, but as one of the staunchest and most pro-Palestine political party policies in the world by Palestinians. The Greens in Australia and in New South Wales have faced slander, they have faced intimidation, they have faced threats, and for their stance on Palestine and for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions on Israel. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Marine Faruqi. She's the Senator for New South Wales. And she is the Deputy Leader of the Greens, and she is a strong friend of Palestine. Give it up for Marine!
I do speak today with a profound sense of sorrow, sadness, and a very heavy heart for the innocent civilians who have lost their lives in Gaza and Israel. My thoughts are with those who are mourning the loss of their loved ones. My thoughts are with those who are living the brutal savagery of the war in Gaza, perpetrated by the Israeli government. And I want to make it clear clear, I want to make it clear, no civilian should be the target of the violence of war. That much is obvious. That much we have said before. Yet, we are asked again and again if we condemn civilian deaths. What an offensive and abhorrent assumption that we wouldn't. Palestinians know better than most the violence of oppression, of occupation. They have lived under Israeli occupation for 75 years. We know. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! We know that there is no place for any kind of racism, discrimination, anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia. You know what else we know, and what else I know, is the importance of telling the truth. And I also know the harsh consequences of telling the truth. But that will not stop me from telling it exactly like it is. I will not be silenced. We will not be silenced. And let me say this. I will never apologize for demanding an end to occupation, the oppression, and the crime of apartheid being committed by the state of Israel. I will never apologize for telling the truth. And the truth is this. The truth is this. The atrocities being committed by Israel are war crimes. They are the very definition of collective punishment that Palestinians have borne for decades now. This is not new. This is not new. In Gaza, civilians are on the precipice of annihilation because the blockade means that they have literally nowhere to go, as they have been cut off from water, from electricity, and from other essential supplies. And as Israel continues its deadly bombing of civilians in Gaza, the fate of hundreds of thousands remains uncertain in the besieged strip. Millions, that's right. Israeli missiles have now been raining down for days on apartment buildings, homes, mosques, refugee camps, and there has been so much harm done to hospitals and schools as well. Health authorities in Gaza said on Friday that around 1,900 Palestinians have been killed and another 7,700 wounded by Israeli strikes that have turned entire buildings into complete rubble. And more than half of those who have been killed are women and children. More than 1 million people in Gaza are being forced to flee to the south of this open-air prison as Israeli strikes continue to rain down. There is absolutely no safe place for them, nowhere to go. Yet, disgracefully, the New South Wales police and the New South Wales government have made shameful attempts to silence us. They have made shameful attempts to stop us from coming together to shine a light on the worsening crisis in Gaza. Any attempt to silence us is an unjustifiable abuse of political power. We have a right to speak up. We have a right to speak up. We have a right to protest. We have a right to assembly. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. The Palestinian community and its supporters and allies have a right to be here like we are today and any other day. And we will not surrender this right. We will not surrender this right to protest. The truth is this, my friends. The truth is this. The erasure of Palestinian suffering is a long-standing policy for both major parties in Australia. The bipartisan consensus on supporting Israel's bombing of Gaza and painting it as defense is neither surprising, sadly, nor new. This enables and empowers Israel to continue the oppression of Palestinians with impunity. And that is an utter disgrace. And as our government continues to shield the apartheid state of Israel from all accountability, we gather here to tell them that we see through their lies, we see through their hypocrisy, which landmarks were lit up in the colors of the Palestinian flag when in 2014, Israel carpet bombed civilians from one end of the besieged Gaza Strip to the other, with 2,000 Palestinians killed. Where are the colors of the Palestinian flag when civilians are being killed right now by Israeli bombing?
Shame.
Confronted with this dehumanization of Palestinians, we gather here today in solidarity with Palestinians who have lived through brutal occupation and oppression for 75 years. It's al-Nakba every day for them. That's the situation. And finally, the truth is this. Israel has signaled the genocide of Gaza. It is there for everyone to see. This horror is unfolding, and political leaders of so-called civilized Western countries who portray themselves as human rights advocates are completely silent. There is deathly silence. They can see justice for everyone, but not for Palestinians. And they should hang their heads in shame forever. But I do want to say to all of you here today, to Palestinians here and around the world, some of us have the courage to speak out. Some of us have the courage to turn up to rallies. Some of us have the courage to demand justice for Palestine. So remember, you are not alone. And there will come a time when there will be peace. And when that time comes, history will not look back kindly on this colonial government supporting another.